Frank, if you can begin.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Frank Graviti. For those of you who don't know me, who are watching, I'm Associate Professor in the Department of History and also in the African American and African Diaspora Studies Department. Thanks for bearing with us. We're just managing the technological aspects of this conversation, but we're very excited to be here. You know, normally faculty and students spend their summers doing their research, figuring out what they're going to teach next year, among other things, but this is not a normal summer. Indeed, this is not a normal year. And the COVID-19 pandemic has sent many of us scrambling around trying to figure out how we're going to do our jobs, how we're going to carry out our teaching, our scholarship, and our administrative work over the next few months and the year. And then, of course, there have been the protests prompted by the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and the extraordinary moment that we're facing in the history of this country and indeed the history of the world. This panel, Black Lives Matter, a conversation with historians, invites us as historians and members of the Columbia community and those of us who are watching to reflect on what's happening in the country and in the world right now. Of course, it has been prompted by the extraordinary protest movement that has enveloped the country and the world. But many of us in our department and indeed elsewhere have been engaged in social justice oriented activism, scholarship, teaching, mentoring, and advocacy for quite some time, right? And at the department level, I will say our Committee on Inclusion and Diversity, despite its vanilla title, has been slowly working on taking on many of the challenges presented by the Me Too movement, the Women's March, Black Lives Matter, and trying to figure out ways to incorporate it into our department culture. So this panel really is a reflection of these departmental level efforts on the individual and the collective level. It's comprised of a selection of faculty, students, and staff who've been doing this kind of work and individually and collectively for some time. Indeed, we were quite intentional with the organization of this panel to show that this work does not simply fall on the backs, the shoulders of Black and minoritized scholars. A session like this one of its goals, I think, is to empower all of us to take on the demands of this kind of work. I want to thank really quickly our chair, the History Department Chair, Adam Costo, for supporting the CID's work and for this particular initiative. But in particular, I want to thank Emma Scheinbaum and Saida Islam, who are going to be the co-moderators of our session today. Emma is our communications coordinator and development coordinator. Saida Islam is a director of faculty affairs, and it is really them who have really inspired us to have this urgent conversation today. So without further ado, I want to pass it over to Emma and Saida, who will take us through our session.
My name is Emma Scheinbaum, as Frank said, and Saida and I initiated this panel series with the help of Frank, Associate Professor and current chair of the Committee on Inclusion and Diversity. This is the first of many ongoing conversations that will continue between us as individuals and internally as people. We invite you all to reflect and continue these conversations after the panel discussion. Our goal is to contextualize our reality with history and to create a space where we can learn, think critically, heal, and take action. We are including faculty, graduate students, undergraduate students, and staff members in this dialogue. These issues have always been an emergency, and we hope this panel series will not only call attention to this, but will be a place where we can process, learn, and instigate change together. We thank you all for being here, to our colleagues in the department for the support, and our work study students for their assistance. We also welcome you to attend our upcoming panels, the dates of which are to be announced. Saida, you're on mute.
It would be helpful to be off of mute. Thank you for that, Emma. And as Frank and Emma already introduced me, I'm just going to go ahead and jump into introducing our panelists. And I want to thank you all for volunteering your time to be here with us today. I'm going to start off with Manan Ahmed. He's the associate professor. He's a historian of South Asia and the littoral Western Indian Ocean from 1000 to 1800 CE. Stephanie McCurry is a professor of history. She specializes in the American Civil War and Reconstruction, the 19th century United States, the American South, and the history of women and gender. She is also interested in the study of Confederate monuments and memory. and Slavery and its Legacy in U.S. Amanda Faulkner is a PhD student in the History Department. She studies social and commercial exchange in the early modern world, especially the Dutch Empire. She is particularly interested in 17th century plague and its repercussions. And Frank Garrity is an associate professor who specializes in sports history, urban history, and the history of the African diaspora in the Americas. With that said, I'm going to jump right into our first question here. This question is for all panelists. If you can answer in the order of the introduction. The first question is, what brought you to your studies, and how do you connect your studies in history to the reality of our current moment? So Manan, if you can start, please.
Right. Thank you so much, Emma, and thank you so much, Saida, first of all, for organizing this conversation. I think it's a great step, important for our department, and also important that you're the ones who are taking the lead, bringing us faculty, students, graduate students, undergraduates together. So thank you very much for your labor on this. For your, kind of thinking about, there's so many pathways through which we come to where we come as scholars, and obviously there are many personal, intellectual, cultural, social reasons for why we study what we study. But in the context of the conversation we're having and why the urgency that we're having this conversation, which is the movement for Black lives, I do want to think back and see how profoundly I was shaped by the Los Angeles uprising of 1992, which was something that occurred maybe 4 or 5 months after I had arrived in this country as a young student for my BAs. And that was not just my introduction to the United States, to the English language, to the college campus, but also to this history of race that I was ignorant of in I wouldn't say in it almost entirely. And that uprising and its impact on the community, a community of which I was a part of, I was living very close to Koreatown at the time, profoundly shaped how I thought about what structures of power and how those who were deemed to be on the margins, who were put in both spatial as well as cultural constraints and asked to bear the burden of the society, were kept also outside of the classrooms. So I remember taking my introduction to American history class as an undergraduate, and feeling both the absence of a true reckoning of slavery, but also the things that I was at that time starting to think about, which was the global history of colonialism. So I think that was that experience and my own kind of study from that really shaped how I constituted myself or thought about myself as doing my scholarship. And secondly, I do think that that all of us who have worked and are coming from or worked in working class communities understand how race and class intersect, especially in the making of community. And that experience of being in the service industry or being working in farms allowed us access that I never had in my own the community and the country I came from, and I think those were some of the key kind of moments that shaped my perspective on United States. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Should I just go ahead, Saida?
Yes, please.
Hi, everybody at Columbia and everywhere else. So wonderful to be together, and thanks again to Emma and Saida for initiating this whole conversation. So I think the connection between my own personal biography and the scholarship I do in this particular moment is kind of telling, because one of the things that this moment brings home, I think very clearly, is the global scope of protest and resistance to white supremacist structures and practice. So we have the George Floyd murder in the United States and the endemic problem of political violence here, but we can see that it's triggering connected protests in Europe where the brutal legacy of slavery and the slave trade is also very much at issue in contemporary political movements. And in a way, it's like watching a map of the 17th century, the 15th to 19th century slave trade and the legacy and slavery all over the world. And in all of those places that were touched by this at one time historically, protesters are challenging public commemoration and valorization of the figures who are connected to those histories. And where I enter this story is to say that it was always so. I grew up in a world like this in Belfast under British colonial rule during the Troubles. And that was a world of police violence, legal impunity, colonial power, racist violence. Irish Catholics were understood and understood themselves, were marked as an inferior race. It's not a concept of race that makes much sense in the United States, but it does there. And in that moment, one of the fundamental lessons I learned that became a historian was that people will only take so much before they rise in resistance. This has been proved again and again and again. And in 1968, when Northern Irish nationalists, Republicans as they were called, when they rose up, the world was on fire. It wasn't just Northern Ireland, it was the whole world. And the Irish rose against British rule with symbols of the United States and the global civil rights and anti-colonial movements in the front of their minds. So there was images of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Che Guevara and Mandela and Steve Biko and Yasser Arafat, and they were painted on the walls of Belfast along with hunger strikers like Bobby Sands. The news every night was one blast after another. South Africa, Cuba, Palestine. That was the world, and then would come Belfast, one other fire in this global fire. So living through that struggle, and apparently George Floyd is already on the political murals and in the walls in Catholic Belfast, not in Protestant Belfast. But living through that struggle, I learned that people will only take so much, but the other thing I learned that really stayed with me is that those movements could be crushed by violence, that human bodies are frail vehicles of protest, and that's what happened in Ireland in the late 1960s and 1970s and into the 80s. And so when I was forced into the diaspora with my family to Canada, where the politics never interested me, I became obsessed with issues of violence and political legitimacy. How does a regime get to call itself the rule of law or law and order when it's acting in this openly violent way? And I was entirely unable to professionalize my politics about Ireland. I could never write about it in any way that passed for scholarship. I tried. So when I was introduced to the history of American slavery in college, and particularly on the subject of Jefferson as a slaveholder, I was just gripped. It made eminent sense to me. And I think what I did was move my obsession backwards and across the Atlantic to write about enslavers, slaveholders, enslavers as we now think of them. And first of all, how they legitimized their system so that they could bring other non-slaveholding white people into that white supremacist worldview. And then later I wrote about the Confederacy and how they tried to make an explicitly pro-slavery and white supremacist nation. So I was grappling with these questions that mattered to me personally in my own personal history, but in another setting that I could get a little distance from me. So for me, in that sense, what I study has always been connected to the politics of oppression and resistance. It's just more obvious at this particular moment and maybe a little bit more useful than it is at other times when the scholarship looks like scholarship. It's very gratifying to realize that even these little things we do, like writing about the American, the Confederacy, can be acts of allyship in a certain moment. So I think I'm very focused on that right now.
Amanda, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you,
Yeah,
Stephanie.
So first of all, thank you very much to Emma and Saida for organizing this, as everyone has said. I think it's a very valuable opportunity for our community to think about these very important questions, and I'm grateful that you've sort of opened up this forum. So I am a PhD student here in the history department at Columbia, and my research currently focuses on 17th century plague in the Dutch Republic. And I initially became interested in this because I've always been fascinated by how interpersonal relationships shape experiences of social and cultural and economic phenomena. And as we are seeing right now, epidemic outbreaks of disease are all of these things, as well as an epidemiological phenomenon. So As we have all been here in quarantine, I've had a lot of time to think about how my research relates to the moment that we're living through, to the social and cultural repercussions of disease outbreaks, as well as to the structures of power and the systemic forces that advantage some people and disadvantage other people. And many, many things have changed since the 17th century, where my research is focused, to today. But one thing that has not changed in the many centuries that have passed is that these systems still exist, and there are still people who really experience the repercussions of lasting oppression, lasting marginalization. And what we're seeing currently is a moment when it's really hard to look away from the consequences of those historical events. And I think COVID-19 is an experience that we are all having across the globe, but it's also an experience that everyone is having in their individual communities. And the community that you're in is determining whether you have access to resources, whether the people around you are healthy and safe, whether you can go to the country when the epidemic strikes the city. And these kinds of factors really determine so many, or influence so many areas of your life, up to and including who lives and who dies, who lives in poverty and who doesn't. And I think as we are seeing these events unfold across the country and around the world, we have to be thoughtful about the things that have shifted since the 17th century and before, and the things that have not. And so that's one thing that my research has helped me to think about as we've been all living through this moment.
Yeah, I'll just jump in quickly. You know, as a child of Afro-Caribbean immigrants who came to this New York City in the 1940s and 50s, and as somebody who came of age in the 70s and 80s, you know, this moment speaks directly to everything I've been doing and living, I would say, since certainly since I became more politically aware in my late high school and early college years. So, you know, much of what I would say resonates with what's been said already by the other panelists. Certainly in the late 80s, when I was in college, early 90s, there was this kind of reawakening of Black activism around the figure of Malcolm X. My generation, you know, discovered X in an interesting moment, precisely in the moment that Manon highlighted, right, of the Rodney King verdict and the uprisings that ensued afterwards, right, in the early 1990s. And then, you know, of course, as is often the case with scholars, you know, I had some influential professors. Naim Inatullah, who was actually a specialist on colonialism in South Asia, gave me a sense of the kind of global aspects and the colonial roots of white supremacist colonialities, right? Scholars like Horace Campbell, an activist scholar was very much influenced by Walter Rodney and C.L.R. James, allowed me to kind of understand the Caribbean aspects of the Black freedom struggle. And so in my own work and my own research and teaching, looking at the Black experience in the Caribbean, the Spanish-speaking Americas, and more recently in the United States, you know, I think that what we're experiencing now has been directly related to everything I've been teaching and writing about. And that's been gratifying and exciting. And is imposing some new demands on my time, which I welcome, actually. But I think that, you know, I think what's clear here is so much of what's happening is this entanglements of class, gender, sexuality, and racial hierarchies, right? And we see this in the history of the Black freedom movement, and we're seeing it right now in the COVID-19 pandemic, and the protests are showing the interconnectedness of these issues. So yeah, so it's been gratifying to sort of see this moment from the perspective of my own kind of trajectory as a scholar and as a racialized person in this country.
Thank you, everyone. I will have a message for the participant or the attendees in the webinar right now. There's a Q&A feature on this webinar. Please submit your questions for the panelists, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. And this next question is going to be brought back to Frank. You published recently in Columbian News an article called "Historic Protests Necessitate Historic Action by American Political Leaders." And you really do an excellent job of highlighting how protest it's not spontaneous. It's built on many generations and many decades of consciousness raising, as you put it, and about the different practices of racism and brutality and oppression in many different ways. And I'd love it if you could speak towards all those different connections.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the points I was making in that piece have been made by other scholars and activists for quite some time. And what's interesting now is, we're locating our current moment in the history of 400 years of people of African descent being in this hemisphere, right? Certainly locating it back to slavery. Indeed, this is a part of another moment in this trans-historical Black freedom struggle. But, to me, and maybe this is my bias as a 20th century historian, I think so much of what we're experiencing right now, this iteration has really been shaped by what's been happening over the last 50 years, right? And we know this because activists have been bringing this to our attention since then, of course, right? People like Angela Davis talking about political prisons in the late 60s and early 70s, people organizing around mass incarceration, which in fact is one of the exploding fields in US historiography right now, which has really shown us the long reach of carcerality in US history back to the 19th century and before, and certainly over the last 50 years. Black feminist activism, right, which takes shape, again, throughout US history and the history of the Americas, but really starts to take shape in the 1970s with the Combahee River Collective. So I think what we're seeing now is the contemporary movement for Black lives is bringing together all of these strands in an interesting kind of way, right? So certainly since the murders of Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland, and Michael Brown, that sort of contributed to the upsurge of activism. But even things like Occupy that emerged in the wake of the financial crisis of 2008, Me Too activism, the Women's March, right? All of these threads have come together to where we are right now. And I think where we are right now is this kind of Black-led transracial movement, which is very powerful. And I think as we think about what it means, I think, some of us are coming to a sort of literacy around anti-Black racism, but we cannot forget, and this is why I kind of bring together these threads of movements in my answer here, the ways in which these are all interconnected, right? We can't just do the work of anti-racism while forgetting about sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and class stratification, right? And I think this is very important for us as people who are trying to move ahead and push these issues to the fore, right? They are interconnected. We can't just show that we know what anti-racism is. We have to demonstrate how it's connected to these other isms and hierarchies that have contributed to this moment.
Thank you so much, Frank. I'm going to move on to Stephanie and McCurry, if I can ask you a question here. Recently, you published an article in The Atlantic titled "The Confederacy Wasn't What You Think," and how the legacy, quote unquote, connects to monuments and the politics that surround them. Could you please elaborate on that article?
Yeah, thank you, Saida. So one of the things that I've been worrying about off and on over the years as Confederate monuments periodically become targets and sort of foci of protest organization, like after the Charleston massacre, Charlottesville was actually triggered by the attempt to protect a monument of Lee, and white militias and white supremacist militias gather and make the defense of the statues a sort of new incendiary moment. They create violence around the defense of these statues, and over the years, oftentimes it can be as if the Confederate statues get separated from the larger issues that are being contested by them. And so I wrote the article in The Atlantic because I thought that while progressive people might understand in some vague way why Confederate symbols are so offensive to people of African descent in the United States, they wouldn't necessarily know very much about the history of the Confederacy itself and what it stood for. And so all I really wanted to convey is what those statues commemorate, so that people have a clear understanding in their mind of why they emerged as symbols of white supremacy in the first place. They're the OG or symbol of white supremacy. Why? Because the Confederacy was a 4-year war against the United States to protect slavery, which they could no longer do to their satisfaction within the Union, So they left the Union, took the risk of war, waged a war against the United States for 4 years, specifically, as they said, as it's easy to show, to protect the institution of slavery into perpetuity. This is what they wanted. They wanted to enslave African-American people for the duration and their children. And they were candid about this. The obfuscation started later. And so I just wanted to make it clear what it is that's being honored here, what's being commemorated on the landscape. There's another really important history which colleagues have written about very, very well, which is about the timing of those monuments. I mean, they're not put up right after the Civil War. People didn't love the Confederacy when they had to live in it. It was a really tyrannical kind of government, which was another thing I wanted. That they had to lose. They're a symbol of treason and defeat. And somehow in the United States, they become these honored figures, Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis. It's incredible the work that it took to erect those people as, for them to be now embraced as symbols of American heritage, as the president is insisting on doing, is direct provocation, because they are not that. They come out of a different nation, an attempt to build an independent nation. And everybody knows what that nation stood for. And in fact, those statues were put up not immediately after the war, when it was very difficult to romanticize the Confederacy. They were put up starting 30 years later in the backlash to Black democracy and the progressive expansion of democracy and of Black civil and political rights in Reconstruction. That's when they were put up, after the federal government gave up protecting Black people and their political and civil ambitions in the South. Then when the white South got control of its own narrative, it started to build these symbols. They were put up as direct threats. That's why African Americans understand them as direct threats, because they were direct threats. They were put in front of courthouses, public squares. It has always been incredible to me that African American taxpayers are supposed to send their children to schools called Robert E. Lee Elementary School or Calhoun College. It's outrageous. And what is going on around those now is just purposely pouring fuel on the fire. I'm very worried about the backlash, but what I would say is that, to go back to my original point, is that I'm incredibly hopeful because of exactly what Frank just finished saying. These statues are no longer just statues. They're understood for what they are. Representations of a whole edifice of thinking and value and power in the United States that we no longer want to live with, and that we insist the symbolic have to be symbolically taken down, not because that matters simply as a symbolic matter, but because it's connected to a larger conversation and hopefully some kind of reckoning about the legacy of slavery in the United States.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Next question is for Amanda. You specialize, as you said, in outbreaks and pandemics, and you did say you specialize in the 17th century, but I am interested, as I'm sure everyone else is, if you could speak to the disproportionate effects that COVID-19 has had on the Black community, not just limited to health, but socioeconomically and other social consequences.
I want to preface my remarks by saying that while Black people in America have a common experience of Blackness, I would hesitate to, I don't want to overgeneralize, because the experience of the Black community in Minnesota is different from the Black community in New York City, and et cetera. But one thing that I think I keep coming back to, as has been said early on this panel, is that questions of power and who gets to access it have direct repercussions for questions such as who gets to be sick and who gets to be healthy. People who have less access to financial resources and social resources disproportionately feel the effects of any disaster, particularly a disaster like this, that moves quickly through communities and via close proximity. And the repercussions of an event like this, of a global pandemic, are always going to be felt more by communities that will face more pressure when confronted by a problem like this, because there are fewer resources that they have to fall back on, or they have fewer opportunities to go to different spaces that might help keep them safer. And what we're seeing now is sort of a moment of reckoning because of a confluence of events. We are all being forced to acknowledge that this pandemic, which was initially said to be a great leveler, is not in fact a great leveler and is being experienced very differently in different communities. And also, while that's happening, we're also still seeing ongoing violence against Black people and people of color by many institutions. But so some things have shifted dramatically and some things haven't. And I think it's much easier to notice that if you haven't noticed it before, because of the stark situation that we are all in as a global community right now, and the unequal ways in which smaller communities within that larger global communities are experiencing that.
Thank you for that, Amanda. Our next question is for Manon. Why should issues surrounding anti-Blackness and police brutality be an issue for everyone and everywhere, not only limited to Black people living in America?
You're on mute.
Yes, thank you. You're on mute should be the first sentence everyone says in every Zoom. Thank you so much. I think, I mean, as Amanda has already pointed out, that there is a world of the 17th century that seems to have institutional infrastructure that we can see still surrounding us, both in terms of the institutions that are built, but also in terms of some of the key legacies of that world. And I think that the colonialism and enslavement of people are two such institutions that work alongside capitalism to frame how there is a globality to the phenomena that we are seeing here. So if we think about, for example, like the histories of the Royal Africa Society and the East India Companies, both companies that emerge in France, in the Netherlands, in UK, in which white men invest their money either as within the royal families or as businessmen, as merchants, both for the transportation of human beings enslaved against their will, but also for the acquisition of territory and for the extraction of material underneath that territory in South Asia, in South America, in the Caribbean. So the histories of colonialism, capitalism, thus allow us to kind of think of this immediately as a global issue that continues to this day. One of the manifestation of that continuation are, for example, the colonial laws that did not only organize societies in North America and in India, in the Caribbean, but they continue to organize societies in places like South Asia, where a lot of those colonial laws are still on the books and are actually used. Sedition is used, the laws against abortion, laws against rape, all of these laws are continually part of the overall societies, even if we think of them as belonging to an earlier age, to a colonized era. So I think one of the ways in which the question of anti-Blackness and police brutality becomes an issue for everyone and everywhere is precisely because the infrastructure of thought, of knowing that orients us in dehumanizing someone are legacies or living legacies, really, in institutions around the world. And when we watch from a global perspective, when we watch the uprisings that are happening at the current moment, we do see them, we see it, as Stephanie said, there's a global map to it, but we also see how other communities, other oppressed communities, other marginalized communities can get to have a light shine on their plight within their context under this global and unified struggle. I'm thinking here precisely about Native peoples, both in Australia, in Peru, in North America, whose lives get occluded, both not only in the question of COVID-19, but also in the question of movement for Black lives. I'm also thinking about Dalits and Muslims in South Asia, who there have been a recent spate of lynchings in India under the context of the COVID lockdown. And before that, for eating beef or accusations of eating beef. So we see that these systems of dehumanization, of oppression, of violence that target the marginalized, that target the historically eluded and occluded communities, a moment like this global moment where we are recognizing as a community anti-Blackness allows us to think about all of the other solidarities that are necessarily a part of any restoration, any justice that we can imagine. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ahmed. Our next question is for Stephanie. This is actually a question submitted by one of our graduate PhD students. And the question is, on our own campus and in the broader society, how can we support modes of public and collective remembering that acknowledge and mourn legacies of white supremacy, genocide, displacement, terror, etc., while dismantling their physical legacy?
Well, of course, this is the immediate question that confronts us all. And it's not like I have some fantastic answer to this. I think what I would say to begin with, in the event that it's helpful at all, is that, and I think my colleagues probably have more significant things to say about this, it's that I think we have to meet these challenges with what we have to bring. So if that's your will, if it's your intention to be part of the solution, to be part of the struggle, to be part of the recognition of the damage, then I think you have to start where you live. And for me, that has, I mean, this sounds, I think this sounds, I'm afraid this sounds kind of trite and simplistic, but for me, that has always been as a teacher and a scholar. And this is where I think I can bring what I know and what I understand to bear on a contemporary struggle. So, so I don't think, like, for example, I think this is a really interesting moment because we're the history department, right? We're the whole history department, various parts of it at Columbia. And Saida and Emma probably already know that history departments, historians and the humanities are not exactly the most valued part of any university. It's very easy to underfund, etc. But one of the things that has been so striking about the last couple of months is how, you know, everybody is relying on historians to decode what's going on in front of their eyes. The best journalists that are writing, Jamel Bowie and all these people, Hannah Nicole Smith, they're the people who are writing these incredible analyses for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, Adam Sturwer. They're drawing really heavily on the work of historians. And this makes perfect sense because the control of the historical narrative is incredibly important to people who are in power, and dismantling it is a really important part of any challenge to that. So I think it's a simplistic answer, but I don't think it's a completely pointless answer. In part, it's to do what you do, but with more direct political intention. And so for us, for me, you know, what can I contribute in this particular moment is to try to be sensitive to who should speak and when, but to try to, you know, contribute what you can as a teacher, as a writer, as a historian. And I feel like I've always felt that, and I think this is a moment where we're kind of reminded of the value of that, because our students actually are out there in the world. They aren't at all confused about what's going on. They're trying to educate their parents, their siblings, their friends. You know, so what we do all the time is part and parcel of that struggle. And, you know, I then want to be in conversation as we are today about ourselves and our own unit, and trying to be more self-conscious about equity and recognition of the ways in which we're all potentially part of the problem if we don't think consciously enough about how this has all worked, even in our own institution, in our own discipline. And I'm learning a huge amount by the eruption of anger that people are expressing, Black in the Ivory, the way people are talking about what it means to be a historian, a minority historian, an African-American historian in this moment, or any other kind of minority historian in this moment. I have some small insight into that because it wasn't exactly easy to be a woman historian or a feminist historian either in the discipline. But I think, you know, the courses we teach, Colombian slavery, the things that we do in our own institution, but most importantly, I think how we treat each other and how we interact with each other, and the way we try to break down the hierarchies in our own community, that's part of it, an answer.
Thank you. Let's see. Saida, I think you're asking the next question.
Yeah, sorry, I was
That's
trying
okay.
to unmute myself. So this is a two-parted question. One we received via email, and one is here in the chat, but they sort of go hand in hand, Frank. So I'm going to start off by asking you this question. Pulling it here from the chat, I'm going to read it verbatim. It says, every news outlet / media company is posting lists of suggested resources, readings, docs, podcasts, etc. for people. For people to consult in this moment. Could you each suggest, and starting with you, Frank, please, perhaps one resource that you think is necessary in this moment, perhaps something underappreciated / underread? The second part to this question, which was sent from someone else, but they go hand in hand. It says, also for people who feel helpless and are unsure how to be a part of the conversation or take action to bring about change, what advice would you give to them on where to begin? So Frank, if you could please.
Sure. You know, so I'm struck by the interest in the work that historians and activists are doing now. You know, I made a kind of a sarcastic tweet the other day that a lot of people are peddling anti-racist literature, and that's me being a snob probably. But you know, the book that I think people need to read right now is Barbara Ransby's "Making All Black Lives Matter." Barbara Ransby, Professor Ransby, an alum of Columbia, but that's not the only reason why she's noteworthy, right? She's been a long time a Black woman historian activist, wrote about Ella Baker, wrote about Slaughter Robeson. And this book, which was published, I think in 2017-18, really allows people to understand the kind of the current moment of Black activism that the Floyd murder has catalyzed. You know, so I think it brings together so many threads that I think folks that I mentioned earlier, particularly the question around sexuality and feminism, and how it has really shaped this moment of Black activism in ways that it didn't maybe before. And I think, you know, where we start, you know, it's interesting. I've talked to some people, and some folks feel inspired, and then some folks feel really helpless. But, you know, I think what the COVID-19 pandemic has given us is an urgency to act. You know, we don't have a kind of, you know, the privilege of standing still just to survive, right? Even if that means, you know, putting on a mask every day. I know that seems silly, but I really think that there's a way in which the protests have demonstrated to us that we can act now. Right, and not wait for somebody to tell us to move, not worry about offending people, which is another thing that I think imprisons some folks right now. And I think there's just plenty of models out there that we see on social media, that we see, you know, in our neighborhoods, that I think people can draw from. And I think that, you know, I've been already a bit of part of conversations on webinars where I see people talking very differently. People who are not Black talking differently about systemic racism. You know, and some of that is just regurgitation, but I think some of that is a real awakening that I see happening out there right now, that I think that gives us models that we can draw from. You know, that's kind of a vague answer, but you know, I'm hesitant to give prescriptions of what people could do, but I think we're seeing models out there in ways that we didn't before. And I think people are sort of following what Stephanie was saying, could think about what would work in their realm, in their lane, and I think that that's the way to proceed.
Emma.
Thank you. I was also trying to unmute again. It's a theme. Professor Ahmed, this is a question submitted via our Q&A. Why do you think it's important to decolonize the curriculum, and how would you start to do so? And maybe we can start with maybe defining what decolonizing curriculum even means for those who might not know.
Sure. That's a big question.
Yes.
I think, I think decolonization is generally meant to mark a process, really, a movement of various degrees of freedoms through which, starting after the end of the Second World War, the previous decolonized spaces became and asserted through resistance, through revolution, a way of emancipation, a way of having their freedom, being able to control their territory, being able to control their subjecthood. And I think the kind of thinking about decolonization has become very important in recent years. When I was in graduate school, we were often thinking about post-colony as a rubric. But I come from Pakistan. I grew up in a military dictatorship. We never had a post-colony, as I like to say. We had colonial rule, and then we had martial rule. And so there was no moment in which we could imagine emancipatory politics without getting well shot. And so I think decolonization as a movement, more recently as an analytical movement or a way to think about the questions of power, sovereignty, and space, have gotten, I think, have caught on or have gotten popular precisely because, my sense is, because it allows us to put to a lie the universal claim of Enlightenment thought. So it allows us to confront Enlightenment's the sort of insistence that its understanding of humanity, of human rights, of sovereignty, of law itself, or liberal thought, are somehow the most pristine, most immaculate, and most resonant versions of that. And I think decolonial thinkers, I'm thinking everyone from W.B. Du Bois to Aimé and Suzanne Césaire to Gandhi, Ambedkar, Malcolm X, Walter Rodney, Sylvia Wynter. There's a huge list of scholars who were able to not just show the ways in which Enlightenment politics, Enlightenment policies contributed to the dehumanization and colonialization of the rest of the world, of the darker people, as Vijay Prashad once said, but also it forced the colonized subject, in the words of Fanon, to kind of think of himself as themselves as a bifurcated individual. So I think that's sort of a thumbnail on it. How do we do the curriculum? I think we read these thinkers. We put them in our syllabi. But I would even suggest that let's start with admitting graduate students who are Black, Indigenous, POC. Let's hire Black, Indigenous, and POC historians. Let's tenure Black, Indigenous, and POC historians. Let's make them full professors. Let's give them chairs. Let's also change the name of the chairs that belong to racists and eugenicists. So let's create a system through which we can think about thought, about institution, about syllabi, about ways in which we approach pedagogy, ways in which we approach scholarship. So it's far greater than citational politics, though citational politics is extremely important. It's far greater than drawing a straight line between Hobbes and Locke and Barack Obama. It is about recognizing the multiplicity of voices, the critiques, the resistances that are fundamental part of our history, and making that our present. So that will be my answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pull another question from the chat here. It says, and this is for everyone, whoever wants to answer it first. How should we communicate the history and present pervasion of systemic racism to people who are resistant to these ideas, especially those who distrust academia? Is it worth it to spend time trying to convince people of the existence of widespread anti-Blackness if they don't believe in it? Don't all jump up at once. Frank, do you want to start with answering that question?
Sure. You know, I don't have a coherent answer to that question. You know, it's interesting because, you know, I come from an era where I think many of us who were, you know, see ourselves enlightened around systemic racism and social injustice, you know, find our own people, right? You know, constitute community around with people who are fellow travelers, which is not to say that we're doctrinaire and that we all should think the same, but that, you know, we sort of take for granted that people are not going to be convinced, you know, and so you build around the people who are persuaded or willing to be persuaded. But I think what's happening now is that at least there's a performance of more people being persuaded, you know, and I think that presents us an opportunity, you know, whether that's the, you know, the institution of Columbia, whether that's corporate America, right? There's been a rhetoric shift that's happened here in recent weeks. It's almost as if the corporate world is following the lead of Nike when they decided to make Colin Kaepernick, you know, do their ad in support of him in their formulaic kind of facile way, right? There's been a major shift around at least a rhetoric understanding of systemic racism. So, you know, even though there are going to be hardcore white nationalists and folks who don't think that it's important, I think this moment presents us with an opportunity. This also goes to one of the other questions that are in the chat, right? But what's different about this moment? There's been this almost dizzying, you know, stunning reversal here in some ways, seemingly, right? In which, you know, everywhere you turn, everybody's saying Black Lives Matter. And, you know, there could be, those of us could be, you know, cynical about it and snicker, but I think it's a rhetorical opportunity for people who are seeking to convince and mobilize around these issues. And I think, so that's how I would answer that question. But also to not waste too much time with those folks, because there's plenty of people to work with who are willing to be convinced.
Yeah, I would also just say, in following what Frank just mentioned, that it's really interesting that in this sort of what is hopefully a late Trumpian moment, okay, hopefully we're near the end of this, when the conservative, there's a whole separate conservative media universe, which felt so powerful for so long, doesn't quite feel like that anymore. And where different versions of history are being referenced than before. So that, like, for example, when I wrote that article in The Atlantic last week, I am still going to get that the predictable hate mail. Okay, it's going to come. There are people who can never be convinced. But what's striking is how many people have moved, as Frank said, to a different position, and who, so even with this enormously ginned up hostility to academics and to knowledge and to experts, there are these mediating figures, and they're taking a huge amount of heat too, as the 1619 Project showed. But it doesn't come necessarily directly from us. I guess that's one answer, is that we teach teachers, we teach students, people, journalists read what we write, not me specifically, but all of that amazing scholarship that's out there. And it makes its way in and it becomes referenced. And then there's just the fact that people in communities are making different decisions. I mean, the Confederate monument issue can look, for example, unmovable, and then people just take them down. It was in stasis for ages. You know, they were blocked by laws. The president is still trying to do that. He's trying to use the National Guard to protect these statues. Well, some people didn't wait for permission. They just took them down. And I read the most amazing thing today about ancestors of those Confederate generals who have been petitioning for years for those statues to be taken down, and who were so relieved when protesters just dragged them off their pedestal. So there's good news out there. I mean, I think there is a lot of, we have to worry that there's an awful lot of virtue signaling going on, and corporate statements and so forth. But I think there's a lot of other things going on inside communities that you can see. The tip of the iceberg is when you see something getting toppled off the stuff, but there's community work behind that, and not all that community work is the predictable people. So I think that's behind the shift that Frank's alluding to, that there's reasons something has changed, and it remains to be seen, has it really changed? And I guess as a historian, what I want to know is how bad's the backlash going to be? That's what I'm waiting for. But I'm still also really hopeful that the mask is off, and that you can't really defend Confederates. For example, you can't defend those things anymore as a ventriloquist act for white supremacy. You just, if you're going to stand with them, you're standing with white supremacy, and that's just, not many people want to make that statement directly and in public.
Thank you. Very well said. Does anyone else want to answer the questions? Okay. Emma, I believe there's another question.
Yes, there is one more question. This one it's a pedagogy question, so anyone who wants to answer it can. It's written, as an aspiring US history teacher, I want to accurately describe the brutal history of white supremacy and anti-Black violence that we need to understand to make sense of this current moment. But I also don't want to, A, contribute to the desensitization to Black death, and that the constant bombardment of imagery, especially on social media, can reinforce, nor B, further traumatize Black and other racialized students in multiracial classrooms. Do any of you have suggestions on how to navigate this? And again, this is for anyone in the panel.
I'll take a quick stab at it. I mean, I think those of us who teach histories of colonialism are very well aware of the horrific images, both pre-photograph and photographic, of colonized bodies put on display, colonized bodies rendered in different forms for dissection, both literal as well as analytical. And so when we teach our classes, it is very important as scholars and as pedagogues that we do not recreate that violence, to put that back up on, I mean, I remember viscerally the first anthropology class I ever took, where the white professor started putting ethnographic images in a, at that time there was a corral and you did like click, 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 and it went, it was extremely traumatic to me as a person, because the ethnographic, the field site for that colonial project was India, for South Asia. So I think there's excellent amounts of resources, both from feminist and queer scholars, from scholars of color, how to frame, how to not show the image, how to speak about the image. Excellent scholars like Saidiya Hartman, etc., have written about it. So I think it is up to us to communicate to our students how the power of the image to render humanity and to dehumanize are both part and parcel of the power of that image. So this is something that as teachers we certainly need to foreground.
Would anyone else like to speak to that?
I mean, I would just say that I struggled with this very much. It's interesting how teaching in this particular moment with all of this outside and around us really brings those kinds of dilemmas home. Like how do you convey the history without showing the images of the brutality But how do you do that right now when we're already inundated with images of brutality? And so I just didn't use a lot of images this time, but I think there are certain just practices that are being offered now, like very simple ones, like, and I think we can all, those of us who are academics, can chart the moments when this changed, that we should talk about people as actors in their own history, not just as simply acted upon, so that in the very words we choose to talk about people, we're recognizing their humanity. So they're enslaved. That was an act of something, of dispossession, an active act of dispossession, rather than that they were slaves, they were enslaved. I think the certain practices, like using that word, using enslavers, capitalizing the letter B, these are practices that are now entering academic practice, which is always slow to adopt these things. And also, I think when you have to teach things like lynching, for example, I taught a course on the Ku Klux Klan this year, and it was horrendous to try to figure out what to do about these descriptions. And then later, the images of white supremacist lynching violence. But I think one strategy which we have learned from African-American studies is to use the critics of those practices from the time and place as the commentators on it, so that they're not just sitting up there like these images of dehumanization and then you leave the students. In other words, they were never unchallenged and uncontested. And I think one of the things we have to do is make sure that when we use them, we reconstruct the conversation and the contestation around them. And that's something I'm learning as I go, because I don't necessarily know all the history of Black resistance and protest in the later periods. But I think that's one strategy, is that you don't comment on those things. You bring contemporaries to comment on those things. And, you know, I think this is part of the reason, for example, why people are so interested in Ida B. Wells right now, is that as a Black journalist in time and place, she did so much to publicize and challenge the claims of the lynchers. And, you know, let's put up a few statues to Ida B. Wells around this country. I would also just tell teachers, especially, that there are resources like the Equal Justice Initiative, which I think is amazing. If you go to their website, the way that the public history work they have done, the research that they have done, enormous resources on there for people to educate themselves and then use it with their students.
Thank you. So we are going to ask one more question from our Q&A, and then we can wrap up. So we have an anonymous, or just a question sent via Q&A. To what degree can Columbia's quote unquote rhetorical shift be engaged when public safety continues to hire from NYPD and invests in increased policing around campus and in Harlem? How can we push the university to put its money where its mouth is and cut ties with local PD?
I'll jump in here. You know, probably our next session should be Columbia specific, because the whole set of questions we haven't even dealt with yet, you know, even in terms of our department. You know, we're in a moment of reckoning, right? Throughout the world, the country, the city in particular, and our institution, right? And I think you know, part of that reckoning is going to mean the reallocation of resources, right? We've seen this in all the debates around defunding the police, right? I mean, there's been super smart critiques of those who criticize the defunding argument by saying that, well, you know, blah, 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 and by demonstrating the bloated nature of police budgets. You know, there's a whole lot of bloated systems in our own little world here, let's put it that way, right? And so part of the answer here is not just evaluating the question of, you know, Columbia's relationship to NYPD, but really how our institution is run, right? And how our city is run. I mean, one of the things that's so striking to me as a native New Yorker, having come back here to live over the last 5 years, is how securitized and hierarchical the public sphere is in ways that it wasn't in the 1970s and 80s when I was growing up here. You know, Columbia, and I think so much of the master narrative of New York is that, oh, well, New York is safer now, and everybody used to get mugged back in the day, and there was all this violence. And I think that to some degree misrepresents what New York was and what even these neighborhoods were. And so part of what we need to do is reevaluate our own investments in hierarchy and securitization, right? And this is also something that has really developed even post 9/11, right? There's a way in which we have succumbed to the securitizing apparatuses, throughout the country, right? So I think, having become a historian of Colombia, I think that we're in a moment here where, like after 1968 or prompted by the 68 protests, we're going to have to do a whole lot of evaluating of our institution, where our resources go, including the question of public safety, right? If we're going to reimagine public safety, I suppose it's something we should be doing right here in Morningside Heights, West Harlem. Again, this is a bigger conversation, but I kind of want to frame this as a bigger picture kind of topic, because it is immense. It's not just around security and the police. It's really about the allocation of resources at our institution.
Thank you, Frank. And I know that Emma said we were going to wrap up. Did someone else want to answer the question?
I just wanted to add that I read today that the University of Pennsylvania president made a statement today that they would no longer hire Philadelphia police to work on campus. So, it's starting.
Yeah, definitely. I know we were going to wrap up, but there's actually one more question in the chat that I think needs to be answered. It says, many of you talked about the impact of various protest movements in the US and across the globe in your personal and academic growth. What are the parallels and differences you see between our current movement and the past ones in terms of strategies, demands, and responses? So this question is for all panelists, whoever wants to answer first.
I'll go first. I think one wants to think that all of these movements, all of these protests are iterative. That if I stand in protest right now, I stand on the basis of protests that my elders stood for, whether it was 10 years ago or 40 years ago or 50 years ago. In Pakistan, for example, we have these series of poets who were batoned and shot and imprisoned from the colonial period to now. And every single protest that I ever went to as a young student, and every single protest I see now on YouTube, those same lines of poetry are being recited. That's not a sign of stasis. That's a sign of the depth of that movement and how that movement is always achieving, always being. So I think I see this movement particularly as there is a lot of parallels that people are drawing between Ferguson and Minneapolis, in the sense that why didn't certain sector of the population in the United States not come out as they did now? I think they came out now because of Ferguson, not without it. There is no movement today if it wasn't for 68, and if it wasn't for, and 68, I mean the riots of 68, the uprisings of 68 in LA, or 92, or Ferguson, or now. So I see this iterative. I do feel, one last thing I will say, I do feel that I am heartened most by the globality and the global recognition of solidarity across Palestine, across Kashmir, across Balochistan, across Dalit lives, that the movement now is representing and calling for. It is no longer trying to kind of think about the particularity as if the particular is separated from the whole. I think this insight, which our decolonial thinkers have always insisted upon, going back to the Disenfranchised Colonies, the essay by W.B. Du Bois, 1944, 1945. And I think this is what's beautiful and powerful about this movement. So I see continuity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manon. With that, I'd just like to thank all of my colleagues, especially Emma and our distinguished panelists who were very instrumental in making this webinar a reality. We hope you will join us again, as this will be a monthly conversation. We hope and will continue to continue having, we're committed to continue having these very important discussions on race, how to take action, and most importantly, a healing space. Please remember to practice self-care and take time to check in with yourself and others around you. Thank you again, and now I'll turn it over to our panelists for any closing remarks.
No one
And
wants to, oh, yeah.
Right, I'd also like to add that if you've registered, we're going to continue sending out more information. If you haven't registered, please do so. And if you're a non-Columbia person, right, you can contact us via Facebook. Maybe Emma, maybe we can add our email or something if people want to.
Yes, our email is history@columbia.edu. And I did see that a bunch of people asked questions on our Facebook comments, and just so you know, we see them, they won't be discarded. This is an ongoing series, so we're open to letting those questions bleed into other panels as well. So we're listening. keep submitting questions.
I'd just like to say thank you to Saida and Emma for taking leadership on this and inviting us into this conversation, which feels very different. And I'm really grateful for that.
Yeah, I want to also thank Emma and Saida, but I also want to recognize and thank Amanda for being here as a graduate student. I really appreciate that. And I hope that our department will continue to have conversations that are not hierarchically arranged as they may have been in the past.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to Emma and Saida for organizing this event and for creating a space for us to continue to have discussions like this. One thing that I would want to say in closing is that I think we are living through a remarkable moment in time, but one thing that's crucially important and something that we've touched on in this panel is that we don't really, we're historians, we can tell you about the past, but not the future. And it's really important that we, when the news cycle moves on and pundits are talking about different things, that we still remember the urgency of these conversations, because the problems that we're trying to address now have existed for a very long time and are not going to go away. No matter how loudly we protest right now, we need to continue to care when it's a year from now or 10 years from now or 57 years from now. And one of the ways that we can do that is by creating things, hopefully like this series of conversations, and sort of enshrining those opportunities to create positive change in ways that will last, in ways that can move us forward, so that we don't get caught up in the urgency of this moment and then let that sort of burn out.
Yeah, I just want to just echo what others have said already, and I don't see anything burning out anytime soon in terms of, well, I think coming down, and I think because we're in an election year and because we see the devastation that's happening in the Sun Belt and other parts of the country, I think that we're in it for a long haul here, and I think that if there's been anything good about this pandemic and even about the Zoom world is that to some degree we're interacting in ways that we don't when we're usually running around campus in Manhattan doing a lot of our busy work. So I'm encouraged by this event, and I also want to thank Saida and Emma for encouraging us to do this, because I think there's going to be more conversations like this happening and more actionables to move on in the coming weeks and months. So, but thank you again. Thank you all for attending.
Yes, thank you everyone for attending, and please stay tuned for the dates as the panels are announced as they come out. We're aiming for monthly.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye everyone.
Thank you.